12 rules for life were, hey, I see you suffering. I see nobody's talking to you. Let me give you some simple rules that will really help you out. Then you go on your own cross-carrying journey, coma, illness, crazy town, and you come back with the Deathly Hallows version of, now I'm going to give you the mythology, and I'm going to tell you exactly what you wrestle with to learn what spirit not only lives inside you currently, what spirit should live inside of you. All of the human experience has already been thought through. I can't give it to you in a bunch of simple packages of the rules for life because those will become dead wood fast. I've got to get you into the thing. There's a reason you titled this book, We Who Wrestle with God, and not What You Can Learn from God. That would have been a title more people would have understood, but there's obviously something to this idea of wrestling with living ideas, making it personal, figuring out what your relationship is with this stuff.
When Jacob is wrestling with God, that's worship. That's true worship. That's why he's awarded the name Israel. He's the leader of the chosen people because he wrestles with God. So that's manna for the suffering, because it means that if you're genuinely suffering, then God's there in your grasp, right there with you. That's a good way of thinking about it. In the wrestling. Socrates was a wrestler, literally, right? And he was a very powerfully built person. He wrestled before he was a philosopher. It's the same thing. And thing is about the chosen people, Israel, everyone wrestles with God. Now the question is, in what spirit should you wrestle with God? And I would say, remember who you're wrestling with. That's what God tells Job when he reminds him that, God was there at the beginning of time, defeating Leviathan, fashioning the world. Remember who you're wrestling with. Have a little humility, or a lot, plenty, enough to strip you of your dead wood. Right? And if you're all dead wood, then the fire of God looks like hell.
Can I get you to read something that you said? These are your words, verbatim. This is from your ARC speech. This was when I felt like, okay, I actually really understand what he's doing now. It starts there with the muscle emojis and just goes to the bottom.
You want me to read it out loud?
Yeah, I think it's better in your voice because this, for everybody listening, this is part of the speech he gave at the ARC conference.
We're so foolish. We regard those propositions, religious propositions, as something approximating primitive superstitions, when in fact they're the most brilliant intuitions into the fundamental structure of reality that have ever been offered. We predicated our civilization on those presuppositions. And look at it. It's not so bad. We've brought wealth and plenty to billions of people around the world. We've been struggling uphill properly. And if we were wise and faithful and courageous and responsible, we could continue to spread that to everyone. We could eradicate absolute poverty. We could bring about a time of abundance and opportunity for everyone. And we'll do that. We can do that if we hoist the world on our individual shoulders and operate collectively in this harmonious manner and continue the struggle uphill toward the city of God. And that's the truth. It's the truth. It's not some superstition. It's not some primitive defense against death anxiety. It's not the opiate of the people. It's the call to divine responsibility. And to the degree that each of us acted it out in the confines of our own life, we do what I suggested at the beginning of this conference, which is tilt the world toward heaven and away from hell. Yeah, that's
all right. Amazing. It hit me very hard when I first heard it. I don't believe in God. How do I come to
What does Pajot say about that
useful?
when people say that? He says, I don't believe in the same God you don't believe in. Do you think, are you struggling to find your way?
Yes.
Is it an honest struggle?
Yes.
That's the belief. It's not a statement. Religious belief is not a statement about facts. It's not a scientific theory. This is why the Enlightenment is done. That was wrong. That isn't what it is. It's a struggle. It's the moral struggle. Or you could say, maybe more clearly, see, you say you don't believe, but what you mean is you can't reconcile your conceptions with your intuitions, really. And that is the modern predicament, because do you believe that what happened in Auschwitz was wrong?
Yes.
Okay, well then, you've established one pole of the belief in divinity. You've just established the malevolent pole. And that means the benevolent pole is ill conceptualized, still implicit. That's it, still implicit. That's what God is. That's what God is in the belly of the whale, is implicit still, implicit. But that doesn't mean it's not there. Called or not called, God is there. That was Carl Jung, the carving over the castle he built with his own 2 hands. It's there. You just don't know it. But you know to some degree because you're struggling, and you're struggling away from Auschwitz, let's say. That's good. Great. The person running away from hell is also running towards heaven. Now, maybe your pathway would be a little straighter if you knew a little bit more about heaven, but away is something. Out of hell is something. Out of hell towards what? There's the next question, I suppose. Out of hell towards what? Towards what? Toward a neutral normality? Or upward, away from hell, up Jacob's ladder towards the highest possible heights. That's the dwelling place of the eternally uniting spirit. That's a good way of thinking about it. That's Jacob's ladder. And where does it end? I don't know if it does end. It disappears into the heights. And what's at the top? Something that recedes when you approach it.
I come at everything from a very materialist standpoint.
Not everything.
I think everything.
Not the evil. Not your realization of the reality of evil.
Oh, to me, that there's no incongruence there. That's just a nature of biology. I didn't say
there was necessarily an incongruence.
Interesting. So for me, that's the same. I come at that. Just humans are algorithms, and you have algorithms that could lead you to evil. I get why in certain circumstances in a truly amoral universe where...
humans are the creators of algorithms as well.
Yeah, sort of. There's, look...
Yeah, sort of. That's right.
Biology is at play, but females select who they sleep with, and that has huge implications. We all get to invite ideas into our world, so for sure.
Well, there's an order. It's like, I think one of the ways of thinking about it is that it's the same as the dynamic between musical knowledge and musical production in composers. Like the composers are adhering to a set of guidelines, you would say. They're operating in accordance with a certain order, but they can produce an literally endless proliferation of forms. And human beings are both of those things. They're the order that gives rise to what is new and alive, but they're also the thing that is alive. They're both at the same time. That's the hero in relationship to the father of the king. That's Osiris in relationship to Horus. Or that's Horus, the Egyptian god, in relationship to Osiris. We're both. That's partly why there's a Trinitarian view in Christianity. So, because the Father is like a structure. That's a way of thinking about it. And the Son is the incarnation of that structure. And the Spirit is the intermediary between the two. It's something like that.
I'm trying to get people to understand that they're having a biological experience because I want them to be able to predict the outcome of their actions by understanding the nature of their mind and the minds of the people they're interacting with. I have a feeling you're doing exactly the same thing through a different form of encapsulated wisdom, that wisdom being the biblical corpus. How right does that feel?
Well, the monotheistic hypothesis is that everything meets. So I don't have any problem with the
Everything
evolutionary
meets. I don't understand what
biologists,
that
for
means.
example. Well, once we sort out our theological presuppositions and our biological presuppositions, they'll be the same thing.
Yes.
Oh, yes, you can see that convergence is already happening. That's already happening in many, many ways. There's a tremendous concordance, I would say, between the ethos that's laid out in the biblical writings and the what would you say, the analysis of reciprocal altruism. So, and Brett Weinstein is moving rapidly down that road, for example, in his conceptualization of the spirit that organizes human individuals and societies. So,
do you think what they're discovering is that the narrative structure and the just time-tested way that these stories have been passed on into our generation prove that that's just the best encapsulation of that wisdom in a way that people can use in their own lives?
Yeah, well, sure. You could almost think about that as by definition. I mean, the stories in the biblical corpus are the ones that burn themselves into our imagination and memories. Well, why? Well, because they have a concordance with that structure. The stories, this is where Dawkins would have gone with the idea of meme if he would have pushed it eventually. The memes that best match themselves to the structure of our psyche are the ones we conserved.
Yes.
Obviously. How could it possibly be any different? How could it possibly be any different than that? Obviously, that's the case.
That obviously assumes a base assumption that you will react the most strongly to the things that are most true. If you don't have that base assumption, that won't be obvious to you. You'd be like, it's not real, therefore it's bullshit, and you will completely discredit the emotional response.
Yes.
Because if you take a Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins,
you can do that when you're confused conceptually, though, too, and that can block your vision. So, and that's part of what happened as a consequence of the Enlightenment. We didn't understand what we were doing, and we didn't understand the relationship between what we were doing and the world of facts.
But it was super useful, man.
The
Enlightenment.
Absolutely.
Why did it break down? Why does it fall apart?
Because the world of facts doesn't speak, because the empirical hypothesis is wrong.
Will you give me that it's like Newtonian physics versus Einsteinian physics, where it's so close, it gets you so far, but then ultimately it falls down and you realize there's a whole universe to be unlocked.
There's a reasonable analogy there. The problem is it's like the follow the science ideas, that science isn't an animating spirit. It's not a guide. And so the world of facts, see, the empirical hypothesis is that we derive all our information from facts. It's just not the case. That's not how it works. I'm going to
change that word for you, and I think it will help you get to what people are trying to say. It's utility.
Yes, utility. That's value.
Who cares about facts? It's utility. What I'm trying to get people to understand is...
That's what the American pragmatists figured out in the late 1800s. Yes,
so, but you were saying people look at the world and they don't see a water bottle. They see, I can quench my thirst. They see the utility. So someone, I'm putting words in their mouth and I don't know them well enough, but like if I were to sit down with Sam or Dawkins, I have a feeling where they buck is, I don't need the encapsulation of wisdom in this story that I've seen kill millions of people throughout history when people disagree.
That's a very... See, both Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins identify the totalitarian spirit with the religious spirit. And that's a failure of discrimination on their part. They're not the same thing. The religious spirit can be perverted by the totalitarian spirit, but that doesn't make it identical to it. That's exactly what the postmodernists claim when they talk about it's exactly the same claim that the postmodernists are making about systemic racism, is that the system itself is nothing but an embodiment of oppressive power. It's exactly what Harris and Dawkins say about the religious domain. It's precisely the same claim, and it's not true. It's not true. When religious ideation is perverted, it perverts in the direction of power. But the truly religious have known that forever. I mean, Christ himself is crucified by the people who use the religious enterprise as a means to power. That's the Pharisees. This isn't new. So now can the religious enterprise be perverted by those in power? Well, obviously. The most effective psychopaths use what is highest to serve what is lowest.
But they will also smuggle things into the works that were convenient and useful at the time to justify conquest, whatever.
Oh, sure.
And then that stays in the adherents of that philosophy, that religion, then do some pretty horrible shit. Like, it's easy to understand where Sam is coming from, especially with Islam. When somebody does a thing that we consider pretty heinous and they point to the book and say, I did it because it says to do this in that, then
yes, well,
now
it requires particularly careful separation of the wheat from the chaff to get those things straight. Yeah.
And is this why you say we wrestle with God? We're not just taking every word of the Bible on its face. We are pulling from it.
You can't take every word on its face. It's not even technically possible, because the meaning of each word is dependent on, well, the word, obviously, but the history of the word, and then the history of the word insofar as you've encountered it, and then the word in that phrase, and then the phrase in that sentence, and then the sentence in its paragraph, and then all of the relationships between all of those levels and all the other sentences and paragraphs in the whole book. Like, it's not like you can point to the facts in the Bible. I mean, that just doesn't work, because the Bible's actually the structure through which, the reason it doesn't work is because the biblical corpus is a representation of the structure through which facts are interpreted. It's not the facts themselves. It's a deeper form of truth. It's a deeper form of truth.
Okay, well,
it's
let me
the
say
truth
something.
through which truth is seen.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think what I hear you saying is you need the narrative, because the narrative forces a hierarchical structure to the facts that are being discussed, and without that,
Perceived even.
it gives you a framework with which to order the facts that you're trying to deal with, so that
That's right.
you don't have to reinvent that sequencing of hierarchical facts alone by yourself.
Well,
each
it
and every
also
time.
gives you protection against the false consensus of the group.
Whoa, say that again.
Well, look, people might say, they might say, well, our knowledge is only a social construct, and then maybe they mean truth by consensus. You know, so let's assume that there's a world of facts that you can orient yourself in. We'll just leave that as an assumption for now. And then we'll say, well, people come to truth by consensus. It's okay. Well, what if the consensus is the Nazi consensus? Well, then either that's a transgression against a more fundamental truth, or it's just a variant of an infinite number of equally valid consensual truths. Well, you can go down that morally relativistic pit if you want, but that's a form of hell, because eventually the logical culmination of that mode of thinking is that there's no value distinction between things, in which case you can't even move forward, because you only move forward towards something better. And so it just leaves you bereft. Now, the alternative is to say, well, there is a central core of hierarchical truth, and that to some great degree that's embedded in tradition, in which case we can use tradition as the staff, the flagpole, let's say, like Moses' staff, which is exactly what Moses' staff represents, by the way. That's the tradition around which even our consensus must revolve, right? And that's the conservative insistence. That's one way of thinking about it, is that there's a vertical axis of orientation upward towards God, mediated by tradition, and there's a horizontal axis that's part of the ongoing conversation and consensus of the moment. But you got to ask yourself, and you already have asked this question. It's the question Solzhenitsyn posed. If everyone has gone insane, if everyone's possessed by the lie, well, first of all, to make that claim is also to make the assumption that there's some truth that's now being ignored. But then on what grounds does the man who is honest stand? Because it's obviously not on the grounds of consensus, because the consensus is the lie. That's the nature of a totalitarian state, right? When the consensus becomes the lie, you're in a totalitarian state. And that obviously it indicates more directly that there's a truth. There's a truth outside of that. Now, the truth is a process rather than a statement of facts or even a statement of faith. You know, and partly because of the mode of Enlightenment thinking, we think, even Christians think, and probably especially Protestants, not that I'm singling out the Protestants because that wouldn't be fair, that, you know, to believe in Jesus is to say a set of facts and then say you believe them like they're a scientific theory. Well, you're missing the point. which is what the Orthodox Christians have been trying to tell the Protestants for a very long time. And the Protestants know this to some degree. The point is the imitation of Christ. That's the ultimate expression of faith. It's not it can also be proclamation of a set of beliefs, but that's not what it is fundamentally.
When you say faith, what do you mean? Faith that it will work?
Faith is what you bet your life on.
Uh-huh.
But that's a definition.
I worry that a lot of people bet their life on that this is really true because then they can just spout the bumper stickers and they can shut the argument down.
They're not just betting their life, they're betting their soul, right? That's worse. That disappears with death.
Let me play with an idea here really fast. Is it possible that part of what makes religion so useful is that even if you are trying to treat it like a dead bumper sticker slogan, that the wisdom that it encapsulates is so useful that even if you were just blindly doing it because God told you to do, that your life will be better than if you were to not.
Well, yes. And I would also say that even if you don't think so, your belief structure is permeated by the implicit beliefs. Dawkins believes in the truth. He believes in the redeeming power of the truth. Mm-hmm. He believes in the redeeming power of the communicated truth. Yeah. Well, there's no difference between that and worshiping the word, the divine word. It's the same thing. If that wasn't the case, the scientific enterprise wouldn't have emerged out of the Christian ethos. Dawkins, though he doesn't know it, is mostly a Christian, and so is Harris. Now, Harris has drifted off into meditative space because he had to find a God that was so ineffable that his rational intellect could not tear it down. So that was Sam's solution.
But the question is, why would he worry about his rational intellect tearing it down? It's only because I think, and this is one of the things I'm dealing with, which is if you ask me to believe that it is scientifically true, that everything in the Bible is literally correct, I'm done, tapped out, finished, no way. A level of absurdity that I just can't even entertain. Like I couldn't look myself in the eye and be like, yeah, I actually believe it. Whereas if you say to me, hey, this is the ultimate encapsulation of wisdom. So if tradition is experiments that worked, I forget who said that, but I think that's a lovely way to think of it.
That's a good one.
If that's true, and this story has encapsulated these in a way that the human mind can absorb through the narrative, and that this has just withstood the test of time, that if you blindly believe this and act in accordance, your life will actually be made better.
You could say the Exodus description is a very accurate description of what actually happened, but all the people who were there at the time were blinded by the facts.
Blinded by the facts. Why do you say blinded by the facts?
Well, how much, you already said, for example, that when you look, you use some trifling percentage of the available electromagnetic spectrum. Well, when you are anywhere doing anything, what fraction of what's going on in reality do you perceive? Well, I would say the biblical accounts of what happened are more accurate than the accounts of the people than the accounts we would have generated had we been there. They're a glimpse behind the scenes. That's another way of thinking about it.
I don't want to spiral off from this. I want to know if you think this is really true, because this may make your message accessible to people like me as one avatar that it might not otherwise be, that the mistake Sam is making is approaching God, which I will say is encapsulated wisdom in a narrative that you can pass through generations.
It's the spirit of that wisdom too.
That's even better. Okay, so if he's turning his rational mind to it, that is to lose the forest for the trees, because now he's attacking the container and he's saying, but you told me the container was made out of wood, but it's actually made out of plastic, whatever. It's like, does it matter? Like, you got the thing in the container, and the thing in the container is what works. Now I'm going to say something really inflammatory, and then I will shut up and let you respond. I have a feeling that a big part of why religion works is that it is the thing that at all levels of intellect works. It works for extremely smart people, and it works for really dumb people.
Yeah, definitely.
Whereas
that's why
Dawkins
so much of it's
encapsulated.
That's there's some real truth in that. Now, Dawkins' response to that is, that's the most intellectually arrogant thing he's ever heard. But because, I see. So it's good for stupid people, but not like for smart people like me. That's the position.
I'm saying it's good for everybody.
I know. But his response, I've heard him respond to that sort of thing. His response is, that's intellectually arrogant. But
Interesting.
Dawkins believes that Dawkins believes that people can easily become scientists, and they can't. Like science, Jesus, I know lots of scientists. I know lots of people who call themselves scientists. Not very many of them are scientists. Scientists are as rare as prophets. They're rare. Now, you've got people tinkering around the edges, and sometimes they, move things a trifle, but someone genuinely devoted to the truth in that sort of monastic manner that requires total commitment, Dawkins is probably one of those people. He's tangled up in his own. I don't want to get, high on my horse here. I like Richard Dawkins, and I learned a lot from his writings, and he got a lot right. He is the last standing avatar of the rationalist spirit. That's a good way of thinking about it, the Enlightenment spirit. And in some ways, more power to him. But his view of the religious enterprise, it's biologically absurd. Like it's not a functional view from his own perspective. And I know that partly because, first of all, he knows that a biological organism has to be a microcosm. And second, he came up with the idea of meme. The idea of meme is that far from the idea of archetype.
Yes.
It's the same thing.
Correct.
Yeah, well, he got to the meme part, looked over the edge and thought, whoa, we're not going there.
When it comes to our future and career, we have to rely on ourselves to act wisely. If you're going to have adequate funds for retirement, for buying property, for traveling, it's all going to come down to you. And if you want to have those things, you're going to need a highly demanded, well-paid job. Now, one of the best avenues to pursue is tech. But if you think that you have to study engineering from kindergarten to get into tech, you don't. The 1010 Bootcamp teaches in-demand tech jobs in 5 to 12 months. Their graduates are already working at Tesla, Apple, Amazon, and Google Play, and many of them reached out to 1010 with zero technical background. For example, 1010 has trained teachers, nurses, bartenders, TV producers, practically everything you can imagine. And what sets 1010 apart is its get a job or get a refund guarantee, and the fact that 87% of its graduates are hired within 6 months or less. So improve your career using my code TOM for 30% off all of their programs. And click the link in my description or scan the QR code for a free career consultation.
One of the things that I'm always telling people is money, success, fame, all that stuff is irrelevant. What matters is how you think about yourself when you're by yourself. And I want to know what you think about in terms of self-identity, how we construct our sense of self, and then how we leverage that to move through the world in a way that makes sense.
So, identity to me is something that's practical. It's your identity is it's like a dramatic role that you play out in the world. And while playing that out, it has to furnish you with a life. And what that means is that it has to be negotiated with other people. And when you're a very young child and you first start to play with who you are, you live in a fantasy world. And according to some developmental psychologists, at least, particularly this is grounded in the theories of Piaget, that very young children, 2 or 3, are quite egocentric in their play. They play according to their own rules. And so they're not social yet until they're 3 or 4, which means that they have their own goals in mind. And then they erect a little fictional world around those goals. And then they play out the role within that fictional world, and that's pretend play. And when they get to be about 3 or 4 and they start playing with other kids, they have to bring their worlds together and negotiate, because both children have to want to play. And so that means identity has to expand beyond its egocentric focus and increasingly be negotiated in the social world. I studied developmental psychology for a long time, especially in relationship to the regulation of aggression. And most children learn to regulate their aggression between the ages of 2 and 4. Now, for example, for instance, there's a subset of children, mostly male, who are very aggressive at the age of 2. comparatively speaking. They bite, kick, fight, hit, and steal. That's the definition of aggressive. And almost all those children are socialized out of that by the time they're 4, although a small proportion aren't, and they tend to be long-term antisocial children and then criminal adults. It's very, very difficult for that to be rectified if it isn't rectified by 4. What happens with most children is they learn to move beyond their egocentric presuppositions and include other children in the play. And so they start to negotiate the roles. And a sophisticated identity is a negotiated role. And so it's not appropriate for anyone to...
Negotiated with who?
With everyone. With everyone. And of course, this is the case because well, first of all, if you're a child and you want friends, then you can't insist that only your game be played. So I'll give you an example. There's been observational studies of children in playgrounds. So imagine there's a group of children together. Let's say they're 6 or 7 years old, and they're playing helicopter. So they've got their erasers out, and they're buzzing around in the helicopters. Okay, so they've already established the ground rules. They've got together, and they laid out the drama. They say, well, let's play helicopter. And maybe there's 4 or 5 suggestions, but the group develops a consensus that helicopter's the fun game. And let's make our erasers into helicopters. I don't have an eraser. Well, you can use your pencil, and it can be a long helicopter. And so everybody gets a roll, and everybody's happy about it. Otherwise, play won't continue, right? Everybody has to be happy, or play won't continue. And so then the little drama organizes itself, and the kids play helicopter, and there's consequences of that play out like a story. And then maybe another kid comes along, and he's got an eraser and a pencil in his bag, and he wants to play helicopter too. And if he's a socially sophisticated kid, he'll hang around the outside of the little game and watch. And then he'll take out his eraser and maybe start making buzzing noises with it. And when he can see that there's an opening in the play situation, he'll swoop in, and maybe he'll get integrated. It's like when you're at a cocktail party and you hear a conversation and you're hovering around the edge. You wait for an opening, and then you say something that's germane to the topic. And if you're sophisticated enough and the people are friendly enough, then it'll open and you'll be allowed in. Now, even popular kids often get rebuffed when they try to enter an already structured game. Unpopular kids don't watch what's going on, and then they come along and try to impose their game on the entire group, and then they have a tantrum if they don't get let in. And so that's a good example of how identity is negotiated at the earliest stages.
Now that feels to me something. It feels very different than what I would think of as identity. So I'm going to try to put this in context of what I see as the major movements of your work and what makes you so powerful. Tell me where I go astray. So I look at your 2 books, and I'm literally just paraphrasing from what you said, that they're basically the yin and yang. So you have chaos on one hand and you have order on the other. Both will tend towards tyranny. And as far as I can tell, and this is why I do not understand why people are pushing back on you, why there's so much bizarre backlash, is the moral of your story is, hey, everybody, guess what? You need to find this balance between the two. If you only exist in the creative potential, it ends up being all chaos all the time. If you only exist in the conservatism, the things that are already there and working, they will tend towards tyranny, solidify, and cease to be useful and die. And so now it's this game, and you do this brilliant explanation of what happens in a city that shows exactly this with artists. And if you can walk us through that and tell me if the identity of the artist, if that's what you're trying to get at with identity, because I'm understanding what you're saying in terms of, okay, in that moment, we're negotiating, but there's a grander sense of who we become that seems to me to be a negotiation with the world, so collectively everybody else, but also a negotiation with how I want to feel about myself when I'm alone. And the things that I think are right, the things that I think are wrong.
Okay, well, that's very complicated. So I'll walk it through. So as you pointed out, I'm going to hold up these books. So this is the new book, Beyond Order, and it does concentrate on pathologies of structure. And the previous book, which is 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. And the underlying presupposition there is that in our phenomenological landscape, so that's the world as we experience it, complete with emotions and motivations and dreams. And so the full range of human experience, including the subjective and the objective, let's say, can broadly be broken into two domains. And one is the domain of things that are beyond our grasp and reach, and that's the unknown. The unknown emerges. When the unknown emerges, you tend to experience anxiety. And then there's the known, and I define the known very specifically and very carefully. The known is the place you are when what you're doing produces the results you want. And I say want because that brings motivation and emotion into the game. So you're motivated to pursue something. You pursue it, and what you want happens. Not only do you get what you want, but you get validation for the structure that governs your perceptions and your actions. Now, if you imagine that you're lonely, and you approach a young woman in a social situation, attempting to make some contact with her, you want to alleviate your loneliness, and so you hope you make a good impression, and you tell a joke, let's say, in a relatively awkward manner, and you get rebuffed, then you feel you're no longer where you control. You're no longer where you exercise control. And that brings up all sorts of specters immediately. It's like, well, why were you rebuffed? Well, maybe all women are to be despised. That's one theory. Maybe there's something deeply wrong with you. Maybe you're having an off day. Maybe it wasn't a very good joke. And so when you don't get what you want, then a landscape of questions emerge, and those questions can resonate through different levels of your identity, from the trivial, oh, I told the joke wrong, to the profound, there's nothing desirable about me and I'll be alone for the rest of my life. Now, you asked about identity, and I used the example of a child's game, but I could go through an identity. And so I do this particularly in maps of meaning. And so, for example, let's say I'm sitting typing. Okay, we could decompose my identity. So at the highest level of resolution, I'm moving my fingers. And so that could be my identity. I'm the thing that moves its fingers. And then at a slightly broader level than that, I'm typing words. And at a broader level, I'm typing phrases and thinking them up, and then sentences, and then paragraphs, and then chapters, and then, let's say, full papers or books. That's a productive unit. So I'm the author of a book or the author of a paper. That's an identity. But then that's nested inside, for me, it would be nested inside being a clinical psychologist, being a professor, being a good citizen. And then that's nested inside something that's even broader than that. And I would say that that's nested inside a cultural heroism. And I don't mean that specific to me. I mean that for everyone. That's the outermost level, whether you're playing out the role of hero or adversary, say, that's the highest possible level of identity. That's the level at which fundamental morality is adjudicated. And there isn't really anything beyond. Outside that it's beyond us. It's the transcendent itself. And you're all of those at any one time. You're all of those levels of identity. But those are all practical, right? So those are the roles that you're playing in the world. All of those are a consequence of who you are, but in interplay, like in this situation with the child, all of that's negotiated with other people. And so if you have a functional identity, when you act it out in the world, then you get what you want and need. And if an identity doesn't do that, well, then you either retool your identity or you retool the world.
Your conception of the world?
Well, if you're retooling your conception of the world, then you're retooling yourself. No, you can actually, what a revolutionary does is try to bring the world into alignment with
literally
their
change
theory.
the world.
Yes, literally. Well, and we all do that to some degree because we are practical engineers, not only do we perceive the world, but we also interact with it so that it does manifest itself in accordance with our desires. There's limits, obviously, to how far you can go or how far you should go with that. What are the limits? Well, there's practical limits. Nature won't do what you want it to unless you're very sophisticated in your your application of your knowledge, and other people will object. So now you might say, well, you should forge forward regardless of their objection. And, there are circumstances under which that's true. But generally speaking, that's not a very good idea. It certainly doesn't make you popular as a child. And so that brings up one other issue. I would also say, and I developed this idea quite a bit in the new book. You go from egocentrism as a child, you have to go through this period where you're socialized as a child and adolescent. And that really means that you allow your identity to be molded and shaped by the group. And, you think about how important friends and peers are to children and adolescents. Your mother will say when you're a teenager, well, if Johnny jumped off the bridge, would you too? And you say, well, no. But the real answer is, well, probably. If all your friends are there taunting you, you would, in fact, jump off the bridge. And not only that, generally speaking, you should. Because it's your duty. It's your developmental duty as a child and a teenager to take your isolated self and turn it into a functioning social unit. Now, you could say, well, Peterson wants everybody to be a functional social unit, a robot, a cog in the wheel. And I would say, well, that isn't where development stops. It has to go through that period before you can emerge as a genuine individual, which means you have to know the rules of the game before you can break them. But not being able to abide by the rules is not anything like being a genuine creative individual. Those are not the same thing. And there's plenty of attempt to confuse the two things, because it's much better, if you can't follow the rules, to view yourself as a avant-garde revolutionary than as a failure. And it's not like I don't know that social molding crushes. Obviously it crushes, and everyone feels that. These are existential problems. Everyone deals with the tyranny of culture and the fact that it does want you to be a certain way and not other ways, and those ways might not be in keeping with the deepest elements of your nature. Well, tough luck for you. Because you're also the beneficiary of culture. And so you have to offer it your pound of flesh. Now, you shouldn't do that at the expense of your soul, but you shouldn't stay an immature child either. And so this notion of identity that we're being fed is very, very, it's very thin.
What are we being fed? Be very specific.
Well, there is the idea, for example, that your identity is whatever you say it is, and that everyone else has to go along with that. No, that isn't how it works, partly because no one even knows how to go along with it. Like, let's say, just for example, that you're gender non-binary. Okay, what am I supposed to do about that? Man, I don't know. I hardly know what to do if the rules are already there. So let's say I grow up, being a heterosexual male, I want to find a woman, fall in love with her, raise a family, have children, have grandchildren. That's a game. I know the rules to it. Not well, because everyone's a failure at that. It's very difficult, but at least you kind of know what the goal is, and so does the person you're with. Well, you leap out of that, which is already terribly difficult. You leap out of that into completely unknown territory, saying that I'm presenting yourself as something other than those categories leaves everyone around you and you completely bereft of direction.
Let me put it in words that I get from your material. So what I heard you just say, tell me if I'm wrong, is part of the negotiation that we do from the time we are little kids and figuring out that play, we're up on the bridge, we jump maybe because we want to, fit in with our peer group. There is a sense of order to that. Now, you've been very careful, and it would drive me crazy if people respond to this interview as if you have not already illustrated that it is the balance between two opposing forces. But so we need enough order so that somebody can find their way through the world, and that I think a big part of the reason that your work has resonated so profoundly with people is they are left in a world where they don't know how to move forward in a way that serves them spiritually, practically as well, for sure. And so, hey, everybody.
Both of those practically shades into spiritually as you move up into the broader reaches of identity. And look, see, one of the things, I really laid this out in Maps of Meaning. It took me a long time to understand that belief regulated emotion. So what happens is that if you act out your identity, if you act out your beliefs in the world, and what you want doesn't happen, what happens is that your body defaults into emergency preparation for action. And the reason for that is you've wandered too far away from the campfire, and now you're in the forest, and maybe you're naked. And so what do you do then? And the answer is, well, you don't know what to do. So what do you do when you don't know what to do? And the answer is you prepare to do everything. And the problem with that is that it's unbelievably draining psychophysiologically. Like, it hurts you. And there's an immense physiological literature detailing the cost of exactly that kind of response. And so people and animals, people stay where what they do has the results they want. That's partly why you want to be around people who share your cultural presuppositions, is because you know that, for example, even in small ways, let's say you're a country music aficionado and you're hanging around with your cowboy hatted buddies and you throw on a tape and everyone says, great tunes, man. And you're happy about that. But, you throw on a piece by Tchaikovsky and you're in a different subculture, and who the hell are you? And the people in your group will say, man, who listens to music like that? And that's a trivial example in some sense, but I believe it's one that everyone can resonate to. It's very hard on us not to be where we know that what we want is going to happen. We hate that. And no wonder. So, and then, there are varying degrees of that, obviously. You can really be where you don't know what's going to happen, or you can only be there to some degree. But by and large, we're conservative creatures, even if we're liberal in temperament. We can't tolerate that much uncertainty. And you might ask, well, why? And the answer is, well, because you can be hurt. Pain, you can be damaged, you can become intolerably anxious, and you can die. So it's no wonder you're sensitive, or very sensitive, to negative emotion. And so our identities, functional identity regulates your emotion, but you do that in concert with other people. In the first chapter of the new book, Beyond Order, the rule is don't casually denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. That's that balance again.
Okay. I want to dive in here, and I'm going to see if I'm tracking all of this, because I'm putting this in a larger context of this really matters, and it applies directly to something that's happening in the world. It seems to me that you don't dive into things unless they have real relevance. So is it fair to define identity as the self-narrative that emerges from a nearly infinite number of interactions with other people and nature itself?
Well, I would say yes, but that gets to the point, it's so broad, it's almost, it starts to lack definition.
So I can take it finer than that. I am trying to sort of find the borders, and then I will work in. Okay, so if we still remain true at that point, then having in the book, you walk through a lot of some of the people that you've done psychoanalysis with. And so we get a lot of insights into the actual people that you're dealing with and how people can begin to tell themselves a narrative that is very dysfunctional. And you help them out. I don't want to say easily, because that sounds like it cheapens it, but pretty straightforward in helping them reframe. And framing is something I'm obsessed with. And so our identity is based on this. It's a self-narrative that we tell ourselves based on the interactions we have with other people and nature, such that we begin to solidify a set of behaviors that make sense for us based on the goals that we want to achieve and where we're trying to go. Am I still good?
Yes. Well, you improved your definition by adding the behavioral element, because I would say the fundamental element of identity is what you act out. On top of that, there's the story that you tell.
Do I have to be consciously aware of it? Well,
you're consciously aware of some of it, not of other elements of it. you can't be consciously aware of everything you do.
And does the
It's just not
conscious and
possible.
conscious alike make up my identity as you define it?
Your identity is the story you tell about your actions in the world, but it's also your actions in the world.
Okay. Now,
It's both of those.
why does my identity, and I assume as I understand it, why does my identity as I understand it matter to the course of my life?
Because it's the structure of it's the structure from which the plans that you implement in the world originates. And you're always acting in the world. You have problems to solve all the time. And you have to solve there's all sorts of problems you have to solve to stay alive. And you have to solve them for today, but you have to solve them in a way that works for today, that doesn't screw up tomorrow too bad and leaves next week intact and next month and next year. And so there's a continuum of you. So that's the other reason why your identity can't just be you, or how you feel right now, because you're not only who you are right now and how you feel right now. You're this strange entity that exists right now, but that already existed in the past and that is going to repeat itself into the future. And so you're actually a community of individuals stretched out across time. And the plans that you implement have to be beneficial for that entire community of individuals. And it's going to be the case that there isn't much difference between you acting properly with regards to your extended temporal self and you acting properly in relationship to other people.
That's interesting.
So you're stuck with society just because you know that there's a future. You're stuck with society even if you're solipsistic, right? If you think you're the only consciousness that there is, there's still the fact that you have duration across time and that, you have to take into account what the consequence for your actions is going to be on the 50-year-old Tom and the 80-year-old Tom. And so
now here's a question. Do you think that there's something that has pathologized the creation of useful identities in today's culture?
Well, I think each person can judge that for themselves to some degree. I mean, the more functional your identity, the better regulated your emotion. The more positive emotion, the less negative emotion. Certainly, negative emotion doesn't rise to an intolerable level. If you're fortunate, your identity is well constructed. I think that any insistence that identity is something other than a pragmatic set of actions, let's say, that orient you properly in the world is sufficiently sparse so that it isn't going to solve the problems that have to be solved. So I might insist, I'm whoever I think I am at the moment, and if you were polite, you would go along with that. And to some degree, I would be right. We do that when we allow people to save face. But if I'm right, we go along with their presuppositions, presumptions. We don't call them on their mischief. And a certain amount of that's polite. But that doesn't alleviate the necessity for me of adopting a role that other people find valuable. Otherwise, what the hell do I have to trade? And you might say, well, why should I have to trade? Well, if you can live all by yourself, then you don't have to trade. But if you can't, you have to bring something of value to the table. And you can't insist on its value. Other people have to agree to that. And so I can't say, well, I'm my sexual identity. It's like, yeah, that's a part of your identity.
So this is where I wanted to go. So you brought up the idea or the example of somebody giving a sexual identity of some kind. And that was what prompted me to say, do you think there are things that are pathologizing? Is it just that people are trying to define themselves in isolation, like adopting their identity around a non-negotiated with the external people and world, a non-negotiated identity. And therefore, when they try to use that as the lever by which they add value in this exchange that is life, that they're left going, what the fuck? Like, people aren't respecting it. They're not giving me what I think is my due. Is that where this begins to be a problem?
Well, I think that's certainly part of it, because it's a sparse theory of identity. It's not going to suffice, because other people have to go along with it, and they have to be able to go along with it. And you merely insisting that you're a certain way doesn't give anyone else any guidelines to go along with, except for your whim. And that's going to change, and people aren't going to be able to predict it anyways. And so the thing is that in the identity politics world, there's an implicit theory of identity. Otherwise, we wouldn't have an identity politics. And obviously, the identity, it appears to be the case that the identity that characterizes identity politics is something like unalterable characteristics. They seem somewhat arbitrarily chosen to me, which is also a huge catastrophe, because it isn't obvious why those elements of identity should be paramount. Sex, gender, race, ethnicity. There's endless numbers of other possibilities, and I can't for the life of me see why they aren't equally valued, let's say. But even if we accepted the validity of those as identity categories, the theory under that is that constitutes a sufficient, what would you describe it? That constitutes a sufficient identity. Because, you see, we're not having a discussion publicly about what identity is. That's assumed a priori. It's race, it's ethnicity, it's sex, it's gender. Well, no, it's not. And that's actually a big problem. Especially when you start...
And it's not because those things are not universal. Not all transsexual people think the same, act the same. So it's unnegotiated and ultimately misleading. Is that the weakness of something like that?
That's some of the weaknesses. It's also it doesn't provide a very useful guide to action across time, because no one knows. It's a game no one knows the rules to.
Okay, so I think I'm starting to get a sense of...
That's not helpful, you know. So, and then, but there's one more thing too, because there's also this analysis of culture that goes along with this. That's part of, let's say, critical race theory. You take these categories, identity categories, and you accept the implicit theory of identity upon which they're based, and then you note that the world doesn't divide up its resources equally among all those categories, and then you make the assumption that the social world is prejudiced and corrupt because of that. Well, that doesn't follow, partly because the association between those identities and reward isn't obvious. Like, you can't make a living being black. You can't make a living being white.
So now give us an example of what can you make a living? Like, are there 4 or 5, like I was going to say, is this trying to push people to, you should have the identity of the hero or something along those lines that gives them something to strive towards, a historically charged cadre of things that they know, okay, well, if I'm the hero, I'm going to need to be brave. I'm going to have to face down the dragon of chaos. You know, there is order and structure to the way in which I need to move through the world.
Well, remember at the beginning of the conversation, I sort of provided a nested theory of identity. So, for example, let's say you're a filmmaker and I'm a professor. Okay, we differ there, right? We're playing a different game. So you might say, and as you go down into the particulars of what we do, it might even become more different. So if you look at what a plumber does and a lawyer does, as you get more and more fine-grained, they get more diverse. But you might say, well, the lawyer and the plumber are both honest. They're both good citizens. And then you might nest that inside, well, they're both acting out the archetype of the hero. And like I said, after that, you're out of the, things get too abstract for us to, we can't go farther than that. I think that, I think the world is order versus chaos, let's say, the balance of order and chaos it's good and evil on a background of order versus chaos. And so you're either the hero or the adversary, or actually most of the time you're a mixture of both. And it's best for you, that's what our culture has decided, it's best for you to take on the role of the hero to the degree that that's possible. And that would be associated with love. And the love, and I define that in the second book, particularly, the third book I wrote, but in Beyond Order, are you working for the betterment of being, or are you working for harm? And everyone has a sense of this, and they know when they're working for harm.
There is a doomsday clock that we use to track how close we are to nuclear annihilation. The closer to midnight, theoretically, the higher the risk. If we had a doomsday clock for how close we are to a totalitarian takeover of the West, how close to midnight would it be?
It depends on what we decide to do. The opportunity's there for a pervasive totalitarian state, the likes of which we can hardly imagine, instituted with a rapidity we can hardly conceive of. That's there. It's right there in front of us. So that's the eye of Sauron, by the way.
Why?
Well, if you dispense with God, you create a Tower of Babel, and that was what was represented in The Lord of the Rings as the Tower of Sauron, technological tower. And what was on the top of it?
A big eye.
That could see everything. Exactly. So if you don't have, this is one way of thinking about it, if you forgo your relationship with the omniscient, that's a good way of thinking about it, you'll create a technology that replicates that for you, except there'll be nothing about it that will be your friend, and it will watch everything you do. No matter how hard you try to make yourself invisible, let's say, with the ring of power.
Okay, so I want to understand what is the proclivity in the human soul that leads us back to this? And let me give you a little bit of context and then go into it. So you introduced me to Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Yeah.
I actually read the Gulag Archipelago. That sent me on a terrifying journey of reading about every totalitarian state that I could get my hands on.
Oh, yeah.
Ended up really scaring me about how humans can break bad in a way that I felt I was looking around and seeing people trying to gobble up power, top-down authority, a sense of, I know what's right, and therefore you should do what I say. And that even when it comes in the package of, oh, I'm going to save you, like Mao's China.
It's usually when the package it comes in.
Yeah. And yet kills 100+ million people. So is it only darkness in the human soul? Is it only pride, or is there
it's the spirit
something
of
else?
pride. It's the eternal spirit of pride, allied with deceit and resentment and arrogance. That's the spirit that Milton characterized in Paradise Lost. Is it only human? No. Clearly not. It exists.
Not only human, what do you mean?
Well, it'll be there long after you are. It's immortal in a way. That's a way of thinking about it.
But it feels like it would propagate only through the human mind.
What do you mean only?
That there is no other option. I mean, we could get into AI, but I want to segment this out. The reason I want to tease this apart is I believe that people are possessed by ideas, that if
they allow themselves to become possessed by ideas, they invite them in,
even better. People invite in ideas. Those ideas are going to govern the quality of their life. And then as enough of us aggregate around good or bad ideas, the quality of our lives get better or worse.
That's the war of principalities.
So
that's right.
What I want people to understand is Solzhenitsyn's idea of the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man. We all have this temptation towards totalitarianism, born of pride.
Especially smart people.
So how do we avoid it?
Fear. Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Well,
what is God then?
The antithesis of the spirit of totalitarian pride.
Can I simplify that? So
imagine this. Okay, sure. Imagine this. Imagine that here's a form of hell. Auschwitz guard, enjoying his job. Okay, now I think it's fair to say that your experience exposing yourself to such things has convinced you that there's such a thing as evil. Okay. Whatever is farthest in the opposite direction, that's God. What is that? Well, that's not a simple thing to say. I mean, God is ineffable. God is the ineffable spirit that unites all. That's a good way of thinking about it. So what does that mean? Well, it means an endless number of things, right? Many of which can't be formulated in words, much of which is directly experienced, embodied, imagined, felt, motivated, all of that, not just words. It's certainly not something that can be encapsulated in in a set of declarative statements, which is partly what the West is confused about. We think that belief in God is adherence to a statable description of God or a creed. That's not what it is. That's a very small fragment of what it is. Just as our verbal knowledge is a small fragment of our totality.
Can I give you what I think you're saying in my language and tell me if I'm getting correct? Okay, everyone's going to be familiar with the idea of the madness of crowds. And there is something terrifying. If you've ever been around a group that goes from a normal group and they snap over into fighting or whatever, you feel...
Short-term mob.
Yeah, you feel a spirit overcome them where they are linked, and it changes something in the way that they are processing the inputs from their environment.
Definitely. It changes their perceptual frame. Yes.
Perfect.
It changes their emotions. It changes what they see. It changes what they're aiming at, even unconsciously. It's no different than, in some ways, it's no different than the spirit that unites a crowd when it leaps to its feet spontaneously after a particularly brilliant goal. Right? That's also a form of possession, although much more positive form of possession, because that's a celebration of the ability to hit the mark, which is the opposite of sin, right? Sin means to miss the mark. There's 3 separate derivations of the word sin that come from archery. Yeah. So that's what people are doing in a stadium, is they're allowing themselves to be possessed by the spirit that hits the target brilliantly. Right, all together, collectively. It's a form of worship.
What's interesting in that, so let's put 2 pins in things. So 1, the hell is the exact opposite. It's when the crowd goes mad, it breaks bad, it kills, it smashes, it breaks. And then God is the exact opposite of that. It's expansive, joyful, uplifting,
and unifying,
thriving.
And unifying, right?
Both can be unifying,
it has that, yes. It's the proper unity. That's another way. These are definitions, right? They're not statements. They're not descriptive statements about God. They're definitions. They're definitions. That's a very, very different thing. So imagine that there is a spirit that properly unifies. That's the monotheistic God. That's the God of Abraham. What is that? Well, who can say? No one can say. We can tell stories about it. And of course, the biblical stories are stories about that. That's exactly what they are. But the fastest way in for modern people, I would say, is the route you took. If you don't believe in good, well, try investigating evil and see what you make of that. And then start to understand what that means for you and see what that does to you. Is one of the things I realized, because I started studying malevolence a very long time ago now. It's 50 years for me. It's a long time. And I certainly became convinced that in some ways there was nothing more real than malevolence. Now, there are arguable contenders. Pain, for example, is a contender. But if malevolence is an undeniable reality, and there's a price to be paid for denying that, by the way, because you turn the Nazi catastrophe into just a matter of opinion, right? If you don't believe in something like the ultimate reality of evil, it's just, well, the Nazis went about things a slightly different way. Who's to say what's right or wrong? And while the opposite of that, there's an opposite of that, right? It's wherever you go. If you travel as far away from enjoying Auschwitz as you can possibly go. And people might say, well, no one enjoyed Auschwitz. It's like, really? What was the sign over Auschwitz? The joke. Work will make you free. People joked. You tell me they didn't enjoy it. If you think that people didn't enjoy Auschwitz, you know nothing about human beings and nothing about yourself. If you think you couldn't have enjoyed it, you know nothing about yourself. And that's terrifying and should be. And that it can lead you. You see, that leads you because it gives you something solid to stand on. Something terrible and solid, but nonetheless, something motivating. Because maybe you decide that you don't want to go to hell, so to speak. And maybe you don't want to bring everyone you love along with you. Maybe you don't even want to bring everyone you hate along with you. That's a good realization. Better to redeem than to damn.
You changed my life with a simple idea. And that simple idea was that I could find myself as the guard in Auschwitz and not as the person hiding Anne Frank in my attic.
5 of them.
Yeah, exactly. And that scared me
You saw that in COVID.
Yes.
I mean, God, the thing, it just terrified me in Toronto. It was something remarkable to behold. All these butter won't melt in your mouth, hyper-moral Canadians, secure in the fact that they're nothing, for example, like the warmongering Americans to the south, delighting in the fact that they could turn their neighbors over to the state with a phone call, willing to wear those goddamned masks for the rest of their life just to have the privilege of being a state informant. Brutal, brutal, awful.
So I look at that and I see myself and I say, okay, the line between which way I go on that runs through my heart. This is where I get obsessed with the idea of, okay, I'm going to be possessed by ideas. Which ideas do I want to invite in?
That's why Christ says that the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. It takes root and grows inside you, like all ideas. Ideas are alive. Richard Dawkins figured this out, although he didn't take it to its logical conclusion. A living idea is a meme. All ideas are alive. And what do I mean by that? Well, they're instantiated in your nervous system. Like, how are they not alive? How do they not have a perspective? How do they not have an aim, a set of motivations? The desire to communicate. Even Nietzsche said, every drive attempts to philosophize in its own spirit. Nietzsche knew these things. And then you incorporate, you take in, you eat. Sometimes things you shouldn't. That's the eternal sin of mankind. To incorporate even the forbidden fruit. What's the forbidden fruit? Knowledge of good and evil. What does that mean? You don't get to make the moral rules. And that's where Nietzsche went wrong. We can't create our own values. We have to abide by the intrinsic order of the cosmos. And Richard Dawkins knew this too. He wrote a paper stating that biological organisms had to be a microcosm of the environment in which they evolved. It's like, okay, Dr. Dawkins, how far are you willing to take that? A human being's a personality. Does that mean that the cosmos is a personality? Is it something you have a relationship with? That's how we're adapted. So he can take that however he wants. The avatar of the spirit of enlightenment rationality, right? That's a snake that's now devoured its own tail. So that's why the Enlightenment is coming to an end.
Yes, we are for sure going to talk about that. Before we get to that, though,
How did you notice that I said that?
You gave a speech. I listened to a lot of your stuff because you help me think through complicated ideas. Mm-hmm. I'm a big believer in that by speaking, you're speaking so that you can understand, not necessarily so you can be understood. So I seek people that I see have the bravery to actually think out loud and process through. Also, for anybody watching, they will probably have heard me talk about this before, and I was telling you this before we started rolling. I was very confused when you went from the internet's dad, you got very sick, and you came back as like the internet's theologian, and I could not figure out what that change was. But as somebody who I had seen be a very careful thinker, I thought, okay, what if there was something here that I'm just not understanding yet? Let me try to map it. And I don't know that you and I see this the same way. I don't know is the honest answer, and I hope we figure that out today. But I know that you have clarity of thought and there's internal consistency. And so that means that there's probably something very useful because you know what you're aiming towards. And this is the anchor we have to address before we can move on.
Or away from.
Yes, yes. Which to your point about sin is missing the mark, but that implies that there is, because I would say sin is hitting the wrong mark if
That's
I had
another
to
way of looking
push
at
it.
Well, that's a deeper form of sin.
Because that's what I think is happening right now. I really think you're the canary in the coal mine. What's happening to you with them trying to strip your license, even though I do hate the way you tweet, I'm not going to lie. But I listened to that whole episode where your friends were like, Jordan, please stop. I was literally in my house like, Jordan, please. Anyway, you should have the right to be a fully,
shadow come out somewhere.
Correct. You should be a fully fledged human being. You should not have to answer to us, even though as people who have gotten so much value out of the way that you think through problems, that's what we're responding to. Anyway, so the thing we have to get to is I think sin is hitting the wrong mark. I think people are hitting that mark in spades. I think you've become the lightning rod of that.
Pride.
That's why we worship pride.
Well, pride has always been
regarded
regarded as the ultimate sin.
Before we go down that path, let me string this whole idea together. You're the canary in the coal mine because
Why would that be, I wonder?
because you won't shut up about things that people who believe, because I take the stance that totalitarians actually are trying to do good. Some of them aren't, but I think that makes it too easy to push them away. Assume that they are just possessed by the wrong idea. And so they believe, I know what's best. I legitimately know what's best for humanity.
Yeah, but that's the problem.
I get it. Bear with me.
know.
And you are...
Who's the I that knows, just out of curiosity?
in that statement?
That's the question.
I'm saying I know how wrong that can go. Those people are saying they think they have identified the social structure that will lead to a utopia.
They identify their I with the spirit of totalitarianism that has possessed them.
They haven't gotten that far.
They don't
They
know
may not
that.
even be smart enough to get that far, which is a whole nother thesis I have about the complexity of ideas, which I think is a big part of what causes this problem, is people cannot think through these incredibly complicated ideas. So they need bumper stickers. You give them a bumper
They
sticker.
need parables.
Ooh, you're trying to make it positive again. People will take a bumper sticker long before they will take a parable.
Well, bumper
Parables
stickers.
are
Yes,
way
that's
more
true.
complicated.
Yes, yes. That's you know what slogan means.
Yes. No, I don't know what it means.
It's from the Welsh, Slúg Gairm. It means battle cry of the dead,
Why of the dead?
because slogans are dead words, and they're
Like as in
they're
dead rot
brandished
wood?
they're brandished by the army of the dead that would rather drag the living into the pit than prevail, than allow the living to prevail. Battle cry of the dead. It's the army of the dead speaking through the mouths of people that use slogans.
Okay, I'm going to translate that.
Yeah.
You said earlier that...
You know how Solzhenitsyn talked about people who were possessed by an ideology, right? And their words had no personal relationship to them. They were merely mimicking an ideology. All the communists said exactly the same thing. There's nothing alive about that if everyone is saying exactly the same thing. Well, because, and this is, I suppose, where the left has something accurate perverted. There's a diversity and a vitality and originality in living speech that's not there in the land of cliche and slogan. That's why you can't listen to people. Like when I listen to ideologues talk, it's just buzzing. I can't even hear it. My mind goes elsewhere instantly. There's nothing about it that's compelling. There's nothing that's gripping.
Because
or
they're not
inspiring.
testing the idea against feedback?
There's multiple reasons because the speech is an indication that while they're speaking, they're not treading the golden path.
What's the golden path?
It's the path that grips attention and is inspiring.
Okay, I have to say, you can give me space. I need to say this.
That's fine.
All right, so...
I'm not trying to speak elusively.
No, I know. You and I just use such different language, and I think it will be very useful for people to hear the same thing said in like a Rosetta Stone way.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so I've heard you talk about this a lot. When you go out and do your talks, part of what makes them so captivating is you are actually taking a living idea that you were trying to explore, golden path.
Yeah.
It's not rigid dogma. It is an idea you want to find the truth of. And so you go out in front of a crowd to assess whether they're taking it in, what kind of
quest.
silence, perfect. And so that idea is living in as much as it is not rigid, it is not fossilized. You want it to be
It's not predetermined,
tested.
it's not dogmatic. Right, that's right. That's why it's not dead.
This-
It's not already formulated. It's not a corpse. It's something alive that's happening right then and there, right? Right, and that's something that only spontaneous speech can manage. Even books suffer from the lack of that. Now, books have their utility. In a book, when you read a book, you can deeply investigate an idea, but it does risk a kind of death, the death of the words on the page, because they're not as finely attuned to the demands of the situation, the specific situation, as a spontaneous speech can be when it's at its highest. Because it's of the moment. That notion that, that's the third person of the Trinity, right? That spirit that possesses you when you speak in an inspired manner. That's a symbolic representation of the living spirit of exploration in relationship to the highest goal. That's really what it is. And so, you might say, well, what do you have to be aiming at if your goal is to speak in that manner, and the answer is, well, you have to be doing your best for the best in you and other people. That has to be your aim. And then you have to speak truth insofar as you're capable, and that will do the trick. And there's no difference between that and the paraclete that Christ left in the Gospels behind after his departure. It's a reflection of the idea of the Holy Spirit. It's the baptismal Spirit. It's the Spirit of God that moves upon the waters at the beginning of time. It's the creative manifestation of the structure that extracts habitable order from chaos. It's all of those things in its living form. That's why it's inspiring. Why else would it be inspiring? Why else would it attract and gleam, right? Or have motive force, right? I mean, and you can think of it instinctually if you want. It speaks biologically. Those are words that speak to the deepest core of your being, materially, for that matter, because everything stacks up. If everything's unified in the highest place, everything stacks up. And that is the case, right?
That to me is the final test of an idea's validity, if it will stack and if it will point you to things that are true.
Mm-hmm. That's technically true, by the way, because the reason that you have 5 senses is so that your orientation occurs as a consequence of things that are stacked. When all 5 senses report the same thing, you have a reasonable assurance that what you're seeing corresponds sufficiently to reality so you won't perish. Right now, that isn't enough, because then I'll take the evidence of my senses and contrast it with the evidence of yours from your slightly different perspective, and then we'll do that collectively. We're doing a lot of stacking in order to filter the infinite sufficiently so that we can model it well enough to move forward. A lot of stacking. And that is, there's a technical branch of psychometrics, construct theory, that psychologists have developed to help distinguish between concepts that are real from concepts that aren't, like the phrenological concepts, for example, that people used to use to map the hypothetical functions of the brain. There was something in that idea, but they weren't real concepts. How do you know if a concept is real? Well, you can measure it using multiple different instruments at different times and in different places and get the same report. It's something like that, right?
This is why the case against you scares me. This is people with dead ideas, enslaving others with bumper stickers, slogans that they can hold on to, that makes them feel morally virtuous, but they are not
simple. They're simple and morally virtuous. Yes, it's a viciously tempting combination, right?
Correct. One
idea explains everything. Plus, once you brandish that idea, all your moral work is done, right? Very, very tempting. That is definitely the temptation of a deadly slogan, like from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. You can destroy the world with that dead weapon. Yeah. And we did a pretty good job of trying that. And we're not done.
Apparently, yeah. So this is why I think you have to be, from their lens, you have to be silenced, because you force that idea to compete for validity in the realm of ideas. And if it really is ideas, and that's all we have.
If it doesn't compete in the realm of ideas, it will compete in the realm of flesh.
Yes.
Right. Everyone needs to know that.
And its unwillingness to compete in the realm of ideas is a signal that it's not valid, which is why they can't put, this is exactly why Biden saying I'm not going to debate scares the life out of me, because that's what you do when you can't win. Like if you know your ideas are more compelling, you step to the mic all day long.
Or if you know that you should subject them to debate, so if you're wrong, you could learn.
God, even
right?
better.
Because maybe that's even what you want in a leader. You don't necessarily need a leader who's right, because God help you. You're not going to find that, but you could at least find one who is willing to put his ideas to the test to discover where he's wrong. That's a leader. That's someone with courage, right? That's someone willing to kill the father, in a sense, to kill the tyrannical father, because the tyrannical father is the presumption of your own dead ideas. That, not psychologically speaking, that's the case. That's the giant that the hero slays in order to make the new world. Right? The dogma of the past, the dead dogma of the past. It might have even been valid at some point. But you want a leader who embodies that spirit and not necessarily the correct knowledge. Because, Piaget, Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, he knew this, is that the deepest truth is a proper formulation of the process by which truth itself is generated. right? And that's what Piaget was trying to discover when he evaluated children. He
Say
knew
that
that.
again?
The deepest, I don't know if I can say that again. The deepest truth is the representation of the process by which truth itself is generated. That's the hero story.
Wow.
It's a process. Truth is a process.
Agreed.
Truth is a spirit rather than a set of dead facts,
Why do people run from it?
because it forces you to pick up your cross. I mean, really, obviously, like, why do people run is the question. Well, what do they run from? Pain and malevolence. Well, why? Well, it's obvious why. What's not obvious is how you could not do that. Well, you know, the entire biblical corpus is an analysis of why you shouldn't run. What would mean not to run? What it would mean if you fully ceased running. That's the story of Christ. The story of Christ is the story of a man, the man, let's say, who ceased running. That's what the story is.
Can I give you an alternate take that scares me so badly, and I think I'm right about this?
Okay.
I think
Well, if it scares you, that's a good indication that you might be right.
Yeah. The big problem here is that to pick up a cross and be willing to suffer what Jesus suffered, you have to have a conviction that you're right, that hell awaits on the other side of not doing that. Most people cannot think through ideas that complicated and be certain enough that they'd be willing to be torn down.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's reflected to some degree. That's reflected to some degree in the structure of, especially the Catholic Church, and Dostoevsky pointed to that in the Brothers Karamazov. There's a scene in the Brothers Karamazov where Christ comes back to earth in the midst of the Spanish Inquisition, and he performs his miracles and goes about his spiritual business, goes about being the process of the word, and the Inquisitor comes and arrests him and throws him in prison. And then comes down in the middle of the night and says, look, you know, we don't need you around. You're a lot of trouble. We've taken your impossible message, your impossible demands, and we recast them so that flawed people can manage. And the last thing we need is you to show back up and destroy everything we've done to make what you had to say palatable, because people just can't manage it. It's too much. And Christ listens, and at the end, he kisses the Inquisitor, who turns white and leaves, but he leaves the door open when he leaves. And that's a complicated answer to your question, but you are right in a sense that it's too much to ask, but you're wrong, and that people turn to lesser solutions, mediated solutions, like a belief in an external Christ, let's say. That's one way of thinking about it, rather than a joint belief in an internal and external Christ, which would be more comprehensive. And they turn to that instead of seeking out the whole adventure. The problem with that is, and this is the problem, is that you don't have a choice about your cross exactly. You only have a choice about how you will bear it, because death and hell are coming for you. And that's that. There's no escape from that. And so all you can choose is the manner in which you confront it. And you can do it voluntarily, wholeheartedly, in good faith, with courage, or you can do it any of the insane multiplicity of other ways that clamor for your attention. That's right. My name is Legion, right? There's a reason for that. Mm-hmm. Right. So the Christian message fundamentally is that your best bet, all things considered, and truly all things considered, is to take the whole burden on. Like eyes wide open. Right? That's what Abraham does, for example, when he goes on his great adventure. And that's what Job does. There are precursors to this idea in the Old Testament stories. It's in some ways fully revealed. That's a good way of thinking about it in the New Testament stories. So Christ's claim is that he embodies the Spirit in the Old Testament. You think that's right? I think that's the simplest explanation. And it has to do, you said already, that people can allow ideas to possess them. So what idea should you allow to possess you? Well, the insistence in the Judeo-Christian tradition is that you should invite in the spirit of your ancestors, the unified, monotheistic, creative, loving, kind, truthful spirit of your ancestors. Something's coming in, or a multitude of things. How about a diversity of things? How about a rainbow of things, or a plurality of things? What, under some united flag? The union of diversity? I don't think so. It's no wonder that we believe in the union of diversity when we believe that a man can be a woman. If we believe those things, there's nothing we won't swallow. No camel too big to go down our throats. No totalitarian lie we won't rush to embody. So you asked earlier, where are we headed? Like, every single person is making up their mind about that. Well, they always have, but it's really evident at the moment. And it's going to become a lot more evident than it is.
Because people are moving in the wrong direction?
No, they've always done that, but not this fast.
Interesting.
Right? Because we're in a runaway cycle of transformation. And
yeah, I think we're in a positive feedback loop where social media allows simplistic ideas
we're
to
in
be
a lot
imbibed.
of positive feedback loops.
Yeah, the only solution I see is
That's
to
the
fight
dragon
with
that
better
eats
ideas.
its own tail. The positive feedback loop.
We interpret the Ouroboros differently.
Well, it's many things, because it is a symbol of chaos. But one of the
Yes.
things it is a runaway positive feedback loop.
Interesting. I see that as what ends up happening when you don't have the right foundational model.
Yeah,
That
definitely.
you can't make progress because your core foundation is such that you eat your own progress.
Yeah,
Through
sure.
incompetence is the easiest way to think of it. You have the wrong model. That's to me what the Ouroboros is about, which is the whole idea that you're
Well, that's
saying
why
about.
it emerges when the father dies.
You know,
Because
much
it's
better than I.
yeah. If the father is a corpse, the Ouroboros makes itself manifest. The Mesopotamians knew this. So the Mesopotamian gods killed their father, Apsu, and tried to live on his corpse. Well, that's what we're doing when we mouth slogans. We're trying to live on the corpse of the past, and instead of embodying its living spirit. They slay the past. They have no regard for the past, which is also what we're doing, by the way. They slay the past and attempt to inhabit its corpse, like Geppetto in The Whale. It's the same idea. And Tiamat shows back up. She's the dragon of chaos. And her goal is to destroy everything. And that's one of the precursors. That idea is one of the precursors to the flood myth. And the word Tiamat is, they say, etymologically cognate with the word tohu vabohu. And that's the chaos out of which God makes order at the beginning of time. All these ideas are linked.
So if you inhabit dead ideas, you will bring back chaos.
Of course, the dead ideas can no longer sustain you in your active contending with the present. This happens in The Lion King. What happens when Scar takes over the Pride? What happens when Scar takes over Pride Rock? Pride Rock. It's so comical. Scar takes over Pride Rock. Well, why? Well, he's scarred. That's the first thing. He's intellectually arrogant, obviously. And the whole kingdom turns into a wasteland. A dry, sterile desert wasteland. That's always the case. It's always been the case. And we're seeing the archetypal outlines more clearly now because things are changing at a ever accelerating rate. And so God only knows. What does Jonathan Pageau say? Giants will walk the earth once again. They already are.
What is the Enlightenment? Why do we have to get to the other side of it? Or why do you think maybe we already are?
The
on
Enlightenment
other
is
side?
the belief that the material world speaks for itself. And it's not true. You have to see facts through a lens of value. The postmodernists got that right. That's why we are in the culture war to some degree, is the postmodern critique was correct. We see the world through a story. And the facts now indicate that. I've talked with Carl Friston, for example, one of the world's great neuroscientists. Many people know this now. I asked Friston, is an object a micronarrative? He said, yes. So
because
even
we
your
have to understand what to do with it.
function, you bet. You don't just see the world. You see the value of the world. And you don't see the world and infer the value. You see the value. You see the value. And the implicit structure of your unconscious is the matrix of value through which the world reveals itself. And properly formulated, that matrix has a multidimensional narrative structure that's coherent, that's reflected in the structure of the biblical stories. And we know that. Well, we say, well, what's the foundational document of Western civilization? Well, obviously, it's the Bible. Like, forget the theology. Historically. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means it's the seed from which your perceptual matrix grew. You're a more or less coherent echo of the biblical corpus. That's what you are. And the more you know of the stories, the hyperlinked stories, the more fully fleshed that internal incarnation becomes. The Bible was written in consort, you might say, obviously with the function of the human nervous system, both individually and collectively. It was woven together over thousands of years and also evolved to match the structure of our memories, all of that, and the structure of our attention. So the postmodernists, when they realized that we saw the world through a story, which was a brilliant discovery and was made in many disciplines at the same time, by the way, they jumped to the next question, which was, well, if we see the world through a story, what is the story? And they said, well, it's power and its twin sister, its evil twin sister, hedonism, but power. They were Marxists. It's all about power. So have it your way. Play with fire. See what happens. Power. I think power is interesting too, because you might say, well, why would you want power? Like if I could just ask you to walk along with me, why wouldn't I do that? Why would I have to exercise power over you? Well, how about I want you to do something that you don't want to do? Well, what? How about something for my immediate gratification? That's why Jonathan Pajot has said that the Marquis de Sade is the evil brother of the Enlightenment rational mind. It's like, absolutely. Same thing, same idea explored by Dostoevsky in Crime and Punishment with Raskolnikov. Yeah, brutal.
All right, so let me say, if I'm understanding you correctly, that to get on the counter-enlightenment train, we could sum it up in a tongue-in-cheek way and say facts are dead.
Facts are always dead. Facts are always dead. That's why you can't follow them. There's more facts than there are things. You can't orient yourself. Imagine I drop you in the middle of a desert. It's like all the facts are at hand, man. You're still going to die. Why? Because the territory isn't the map. Because the land doesn't speak. How about that? How about all of that? Right? No.
Can I give you my favorite example of this?
Sure.
Okay, this is true. What we think of as the entire world, everything that we can see, is 0.00035% of the available electromagnetic spectrum.
Right. Good example.
So looking at you, I should see a number of photons in a given wavelength that are reflecting off of that fabric, but I don't. I see black, I see red, I see gold, whatever.
You see tools and obstacles.
Yes, for sure. And once I understood, oh my God, I'm seeing a ridiculously gross simplification of what is really in the world, then I realized my brain is made up of algorithms. And once I realized my brain is made of algorithms, and algorithms are designed to push you to see certain things, to conceive of them in a certain way, I suddenly really wanted to understand, what are my algorithms driving me to do? And every idea that
That's why Jung said every person has to figure out the myth that they're living.
Whoa. Whoa.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
What story? Here's two ways of thinking about it. What story are you acting out? Or what character resides in you? That's another way of thinking about it. Or what spirit have you allowed to possess you? Or what spirit have you invited in and consorted with such that it can possess you? So when Cain is bitter, Cain from Cain and Abel, Cain is bitter because his sacrifices go unrewarded. So he's bitter because his work is not successful. And everyone should be able to identify with that. There's no difference between work and sacrifice, by the way. They're the same thing. When we work, we sacrifice the present to the future.
Saw that clip from your book.
Yeah, okay. So now Cain's work is unsuccessful, so he gets bitter. And he's jealous as well of Abel, whose sacrifices are accepted and who's thriving. And so Cain's countenance falls. He becomes depressed and anxious and nihilistic and resentful, and starts to shake his fist at God. He does what Job's wife tells Job to do when Job is being tortured. Job's wife says, shake your fist at God and die. Well, Cain shakes his fist at God and kills. And so that's even worse. So Cain calls out God, just like bitter atheists do constantly. And they have their reasons, and says, what the hell's going on here? What kind of world did you make? Where I'm breaking myself in half with my labors and nothing is succeeding and everything is bitter and pointless. And God says, if you did well, you'd be accepted. And then he says something much, much worse, which you figured out already. He said, sin crouches at your door like a sexually aroused predatory animal, and you've invited it in to have its way with you.
That's dark.
Right. Well, it's terrible. It's terrible. And there's echoes of this in other mythological stories. So what it means is that Cain is suffering, and there's nothing sinful in that as such, right? Because the innocent can suffer. Cain suffers, and then he turns in the direction of temptation. He starts to nurse his resentment. That's another biological metaphor, to nurse your resentment. He starts to brood over his resentment, right? And so what that means is that spirit of arrogant resentment he invites it in, it takes up residence within him, but then he engages in a creative dialogue with that spirit. It's not merely possession, it's conspiracy. It's conspiracy between the eternal spirit of darkness, that's a good way of thinking about it, and a living human soul. That's what happens when you get resentful.
Why can't people talk to each other today?
Well, I think we do I'm not so sure that we can't. I mean, part of it might be that we're talking to each other way more than we ever did, and it's too much. Like, I don't know. These things are all beyond my capacity to understand. I'm still wrestling with what's at the core of the culture wars, let's say, although I do think that the pathological element of it is a war on competence. Restriction
brought about
of
by
speech.
resentment?
Yeah, that's what it looks like to me. And like I said, I can understand the resentment. It's we have to strive not to be wretched. There's something that doesn't seem fair about that. Why couldn't we just be happy being who and what we are? Why is it that we're punished if we don't strive? Well, I don't know. We're negentropic organisms, right? I mean, we have to maintain this incredible complexity in the face of a dissipating universe. It requires effort. It's the second law of thermodynamics, I believe. That's why we have to strive. Well, why is the world constituted that way? I guess it's an infantile paradisal wish in some regard. Couldn't we just be rewarded for who we are? I can understand that. But I don't think that it works. I don't think that's how things function like that. And I don't think probably in the final analysis we really want them to. I don't know if anyone enjoys undeserved reward. It feels kind of creepy, doesn't it, to be rewarded for something you didn't do?
It does. I'm obsessed with this idea of the physics of being human, that there are just certain things that are true, that our brain has algorithms running in them that are going to push us to be striving to, push against entropy. partly just you have to risk danger to go out and get food and provide for your family and keep them safe. So it makes sense that you have that pushing at your back. Also seems to me that you have an innate drive for progress and that you'll never be happy if you're not advancing in some way, getting better at something.
Well, I think that's technically true, and in Maps of Meaning in particular, I make a neuropsychological argument for that mostly based on the work of Jeffrey Gray, who I think was the greatest neuropsychologist of the last half of the 20th century. And he drew a lot of his ideas from Norbert Wiener, who was a cybernetic theorist who was instrumental in the development of artificial intelligence. These ideas have what would you call it, a stellar academic origin. And positive emotion, Gray laid this out better than anyone else, the positive emotion that we find sustaining is experienced in relationship to an unachieved goal. It's hope that drives us forward. We want something, and if we see ourselves moving towards that, then we're in the grip of the positive emotion that we find sustaining. It isn't the attainment. Attainment is satiating. Attainment shuts down the system that has been striving for that particular object of attainment. If you're hungry and you eat, you stop being hungry. Now, that's good because the hunger is gone, but that whole frame disappears. You can no longer strive within that frame, and you need a new frame to strive towards. And so technically, and this is well established as far as I'm concerned. We even know the drugs that people abuse, cocaine, let's say, amphetamines, the ones that are potent sources of positive emotion, activate the system that regulates our emotional response to evidence that we're moving towards a desired goal. So cocaine, for example, is an exhilarating drug. It makes you feel that things are worthwhile because it hijacks the system that does indicate that things are worthwhile. So this is deeply, this striving aspect is deeply rooted in our biology for obvious reasons.
You covered that very well in Beyond Order, and this is one of the things that, and this particular thing finds itself sort of in many different of the rules, but this idea that there is an evolutionary wind at your back, there are reasons that stories contain certain elements over and over and over, and I want to wrap this together in the following question. I
can give you an example of that. So there's a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, and it's very, very, very old. We share it with virtually every animal that has a nervous system. It sits above the spinal cord. It's extremely old, evolutionarily speaking, and half of it governs fundamental motivations. So it governs hunger, for example. So if you're hungry, you posit the existence of something that will satiate your appetite, a peanut butter sandwich, and then you're happy when you're moving towards the kitchen. And then maybe you get thirsty and the hypothalamus does that. And then maybe you need to use the washroom and maybe you're too hot. And that the hypothalamus pops up these little motivational frames, and then emotions modulate your movement towards the goal that's established by these fundamental motivations. But that's only half the hypothalamus. The other half is the origin of the dopaminergic system that mediates exploratory striving and positive emotion. And so the way our brains are set up, way below the neocortex, way older than that, the default position is if you're satiated in all the important dimensions, then you're curious and explore. Well, why? Well, because you might find new resources that could be used to satiate those fundamental motivations in the future. So that heroic drive into the unknown is unbelievably archaic. And then it's regulated by fear and pain. So you go into the unknown, well, you don't want to die. So if you get damaged, you experience pain, and you want to avoid pain, so you experience anxiety. These are very fundamental systems, and they are reflected in our narratives. That's essentially, as far as I can tell, why the dragon hoards treasure everywhere. The dragon is an amalgam of predatory stimuli and fire, which is a destructive force, but also very useful. So dragon is something like predatory destructive entity. And you might say, well, is that real? It's like, well, yeah, but it's a meta-category. It's like there are lions and raptors and lizards, let's say, 60 million years ago when we were still in trees. The idea that there's a meta-predator is a great idea. A meta-predator is what all predators share in common. That's a dragon. Well, what should you do with a dragon? Well, avoid it. That's one answer. Another answer is burn it out of its lair so that it doesn't have baby dragons. An even more sophisticated answer is, well, confront it. You can feed your family with the body of a dragon. It's treasure. And that's become abstracted up into the unknown as such.
You do a great job of telling the story of Tiamat, Marduk, all of that in a way where you regrounded it in the actual historical context. Because they talk about when you slay the dragon, you can actually build things from it. And they talk about
from its pieces.
Right, heaven and earth were made from it.
It's amazing.
And I thought, wow, it's kind of interesting. And then you said, no. They actually used to build the doorways to their cave or whatever from the bones of the animals that they slayed. And I thought, oh my God, when you put the story in that context of you're telling the tribe something that they're actually doing, but you're elevating it. And so you're saying, look, the great hero goes and slays the most dangerous of the most dangerous predatory thing. And from that, we're not just creating our house, we're creating the heaven and the earth. And I thought, whoa, like you really do. So that's why
in Christianity, which has taken the hero myth in a tremendously sophisticated direction, Christ tackles the worst of all potential dragons, and that's the adversary. That's the evil in the human heart. It's become completely psychologized by that point, or spiritualized, instead of an external monster that's the threat. And let's make no mistake, external monsters are threatening. But then there's the external monsters that are other tribes. Well, those are genuinely threatening too. And we can demonize a member of another tribe at the drop of a hat. But then you take one level above that even, you think, well, the most dangerous thing of all is the evil that lurks in the human heart, in the individual. And that's why you have the battle, let's say, between Christ and Satan. That's what that means. It's not all it means, but that's what it means. And so and then you ask yourself, like you can ask yourself this question very seriously. If you were thinking about the most moral possible action, wouldn't that be the voluntary constraint of the evil that you yourself are likely to do? And wouldn't that mean facing human evil in its reality as it manifests itself inside you? And wouldn't that mean then obtaining victory over that? And you might say, well, is that a divine story? Well, I can't say what the relationship is between the human psyche and the world as such. But we don't have a deeper story than that. And I can't see how it's not true. And you might say, well, it's not true for me. It's like, well, don't you have a conscience? Doesn't it bother you? And then can you control it? And the answer to that is almost inevitably no. It calls you to account. And why? Well, because you've deviated from the ideal. Whose ideal? An ideal that's making itself known within you, at least insofar as the objection arises. You wake up at 3 a.m. and torture yourself for your iniquities. And you would think, well, I could just shut that off. It's me, after all. But you can't shut it off. You're nothing compared to your conscience. Now, it's strange because you can ignore it. You can not live according to its dictates, but it's not going to leave you alone.
Jordan, you asked the Times person in the full-length article or full-length recording, which I listened to, you said, hey, don't focus on my illness in this. Focus on why people resonate with my message, which she, of course, did not. But that leaves...
No one does.
Oh, it leaves me an opening. I'm going to take it right now.
It's so interesting to see that, is that it's so interesting because, you know, the only time that ever gets addressed is by the mainstream media. Jesus, you know, a horrible cliche, but it's usually sort of brushed off. And it's usually, well, he seems to be attractive towards young men who are troubled. Well, first of all, that's not so bad, is it? I mean, hypothetically, the most ardent feminist is primarily concerned with helping the troubled young man not be so troubled, but it's brushed off in a cynical sort of way. And the cynicism is also disbelief that that could possibly be serious, a serious enterprise. Well, I think it's a serious enterprise.
Why do you think they resonate with you?
I think it's because who knows the final answer to anything, you know, but I took what I learned about what happened in the Second World War seriously. It's like, wow, we can be really bad. We should do something about that. Like, that was unacceptable. Well, was it or not? Well, how unacceptable? Was it change your life unacceptable? Better be, if you want it not to happen again. And it's not like the next time it happens will make the previous time look like a picnic. We're way more powerful than we were. You know, and we're getting to the point, this is something Jung talked about, especially near the end of his life. We're getting so powerful that each individual is now a force of almost unimaginable destructive power if they so choose to be. And that's just going to, that power is going to continue to increase. And what that means is that the degree to which each of us has our act together is going to be something upon which the world increasingly depends for its maintenance.
I'm going to add something to why I think people resonate with you so much. In the book, you encourage people to think from an evolutionary perspective, which I think is incredibly important. And I think what you offer people is, one, we all struggle with our own internal demons, and you allow people to see how that's a heroic endeavor, maybe the ultimate heroic endeavor, to conquer that inside of yourself. And then going back to the beginning of identity being a function of behavior, by helping people begin to identify as the hero, engaging in relatively straightforward behaviors like cleaning your room, or like in the new book, making an area beautiful, refusing to give into resentment, aim at one thing, which was one of my favorite parts of the book, and see how extraordinarily good you can get at that. Like, when I think about
that's a good thing, is you got to aim at something. It's like, otherwise your life is meaningless. Well, what should you aim at? Well, I don't know. Well, pick something. Pick something. Aim at it. As you move toward it, you'll get wiser. Then maybe your aim will change. That's okay. But at least it'll change in an informed way. It's like, discipline yourself in one dimension. See what happens. Well, that's exciting. And I think that's something that's open for everyone. You can do that. I shouldn't say that, because I don't believe that. I think you can find yourself in a situation that's so dire that there's no escape from it. But that doesn't matter, because the hero myth might not be, the best we have might not always work, but it's still the best we have. And the fact that it might not work doesn't mean we should throw it away. It's still the best we have. I mean, everyone dies, and so we fail in some sense. The fact that a symphony ends doesn't mean that it wasn't worth listening to.
Yeah. When you put that in an evolutionary context, and you acknowledge that people are compelled by biology to strive, they're compelled by biology to progress, they're compelled by biology to be courageous, that they will be rewarded for being courageous neurochemically. They will be punished for being a coward neurochemically. And
yeah, well, think about, the thing about that biological explanation too is that we've been social for a very long time. We've been social for so long that our social nature is programmed into our biology. And so you'll be punished if you're not useful to other people.
Yes.
By your conscience, because you're a social creature. And the question is, well, how could you be most, here's another question that starts to verge on the religious. What does the most useful person look like? Well, who is everyone hoping they'll meet? And that's a genuine question. And that's the ideal. The ideal is the person everyone's hoping they'll meet. That's Christ in the Christian culture, psychologically speaking, independent of any religious claims. So that's this is, I suppose, the essential idea of the archetype from the Jungian perspective. We have the image of an ideal, and because it is the ultimate ideal, it has a religious element. It's compelling. It's a judge. Why is it a judge? Well, if you fall short of the ideal, your conscience punishes you. So it's a judge. And it's merciful. Well, why? Because if you act out the ideal, then your life improves. You know, and I said, well, the question, what is the relationship between these images of the psyche and reality? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know where the archetype shades into reality. It depends to some degree on how you define reality. And, you know, this is, people don't like that statement. But when you're asking questions that are deep enough, you start to have to ask, what do you mean by true, for example? What do you mean by real? Because the questions you ask get so deep that they're of the same kind as the question, what is real or what is true? You know, think of it this way, reality is what we adapt to by definition. That's reasonable. If you're a Darwinian, you have to say that's actually as far as you can go. Reality is that which shapes us. You can't get a better handle on reality than that. Well, when you make a picture of objective reality, it's not the same as that. It's a different picture. And it's not obvious which one should play trump. Now, the hero myth, as far as I can tell, is an evolutionary artifact. And that means that for human beings, that the hero image is the path of optimal adaptation. Does that reflect reality? Well, it does, insofar as reality has selected that. Well, does that mean that reality is a story? Because the hero myth is a story, or at least that's one of the things it is. Does it mean that reality has a narrative aspect? Well, it does, insofar as we act things out. Does that mean that reality is ultimately a story? Well, I don't know. But the answer isn't obviously no.
If you like this conversation, check out this episode to learn more.
But social media and just the democratization of everything has given us some insight into how rotten our institutions were in the first place.
There's a kind of wokeification of the right that is happening.
It's like professional wrestling. Nobody cares that it's fake.